In the fading twilight of the Indian frontier, the wind carried the scent of dust, sweat, and uncertainty. Alexander stood near the riverbank of the Hyphasis, staring at the endless jungle stretching into the horizon. It was a land his maps did not fully show, a land whispered only in legends. But Alexander, the man who bent the world to his will, had come too far to turn back now. The soldiers behind him were silent. These were the same men who had followed him through Persia, Babylon, Egypt, and the burning plains of Gedrosia. They had crossed deserts where the sand swallowed entire armies, climbed mountains where the wind froze the breath in their lungs, and fought battles where they were outnumbered 10-1. Yet this land, this vast, unknown land of India, felt different, even to Alexander. Rumors had spread through the camp. Rumors of kingdoms where elephants marched like moving fortresses. Rumors of warriors who painted their bodies and fought without fear. Rumors of rivers wider than the sea. But Alexander's fire was not built on fear. His fire was built on destiny. He had defeated Darius, broken the Persian Empire, taken the throne of Asia. But in his heart, Alexander believed there was still one last chapter left to write. A chapter that would decide whether he would be remembered simply as a king or as a legend carved into eternity. That night, as the stars flickered above the camp, Alexander called a council of his closest generals. Craterus, always loyal, stood silently beside him. Cunis, aged and weary, tried to hide the tremor in his hands. Hephaestion, though weakened by fever, still carried the old fire in his eyes. Alexander unrolled the map of India. A map incomplete. A map full of blank spaces. This, he said, pointing to the empty territories beyond the Hyphasis River, this is where our destiny waits. His generals exchanged glances. They knew what Alexander wanted, and they also knew what the army felt. For the first time in years, the spirit of the Macedonians was breaking. Cunis stepped forward. His voice was steady but heavy with truth. Alexander, the men are tired. They have followed you to the edge of the world, but beyond this river lies only the unknown. They ask for home, not because they fear battle, but because they are human. Alexander's jaw tightened. He loved his men, more than he loved the cities he conquered. But destiny was something he could not abandon. Not now. He walked outside the tent and stood before the great fire where thousands of soldiers waited for him. They watched him with hope, fear, and exhaustion in their eyes. Alexander looked at each of them, not as a king, but as a man who had grown up beside them. "You are free to speak," he said. A silence fell over the camp. Then one voice rose, then another, then hundreds. They did not shout. They did not rebel. They simply spoke their truth. "We want to go home." The words cut deeper than any spear. Alexander turned away, walking into the dark plains alone. He walked for hours until he reached a hill overlooking the endless forest. He stood there silently, fighting the war inside his own heart. Then, as dawn broke, he made his decision. He gathered his army. His voice carried across the field like the sound of steel. "If you wish to return home, we will return home. But remember this, we are not retreating. We are marching back as conquerors. The world knows our name, and even here, in lands we have not yet seen, they whisper the name Macedon." The soldiers erupted in cheers, not because they were avoiding battle, but because their king had listened. Alexander ordered a massive sacrifice to the gods on the banks of the Hyphasis. He prayed not for victory, but for the strength to accept the will of his men. As the flames rose into the morning sky, Alexander carved a pillar at the river's edge. On it, he wrote words that would echo through time. "Here stands Alexander, who reached the limits of the world." The army began the great march back west. But fate, as always, had its own plans. Along the journey, sickness spread. Battles erupted unexpectedly, rivers flooded, camps burned, supplies dwindled. Even Alexander himself fell ill multiple times, but he never stopped moving. The world had begun to weigh on him. Not the world of land and mountains, but the world of memories, the ghosts of his victories, the faces of those who died for his dream. Hephaestion watched him closely, worried, but Hephaestion too was weakening. The fever that clung to him was growing stronger. Alexander did not know that the greatest tragedy of his life was yet to come. The march continued toward the city of Babylon, a city that would become the final chapter of his journey, a city where destiny waited silently. And as the sun dipped below the horizon on that final night in India, Alexander looked back one last time at the land he could not conquer, not because he failed, but because even the greatest man in history must bow to the limits of the human heart. The wind whispered around him, carrying dust from the battlefield, echoes of distant drums, and the soft breath of an unfinished dream. And Alexander walked forward, toward glory, toward grief, toward immortality.